All right, I'm excited to be joined by Miura-Ko, who's featured in the story World Class, page 55 on Friday Forward. Anne's the co-founding partner of Floodgate, one of the world's top VC firms, and was named one of New York Times' top 20 venture capitalists worldwide. She's also a lecturer at Stanford, a member of Yale's Board of Trustees, and the founder of All Raise, a nonprofit dedicated to improving diversity in funders and founders. Thanks for joining us, Anne.
Thank you for having me.
All right, so can you share the story of the conversation that you had with your dad on the way to that first day of your internship at Yale? And what did you do differently after that conversation?
Yeah, and so just to set the context, this was part of my work study. So my financial aid package at Yale involved having to work a number of hours somewhere on campus. And I had found this job doing office work for the Dean of Engineering at Yale. And what was interesting about that was this was back before the internet was really sort of robust thing.
This was paper pushing, right?
This is paper pushing. It's photocopying. It was literally, when we say filing, it means that there was actually a big filing cabinet
yes.
with folders that were hanging, and you would physically put paper into these folders, which just sort of dates me. But that was the job. And I had told my dad that I had found this job, and my dad's thing throughout my childhood and into adulthood was always asking me, well, do a world-class job, and was that world-class? And in that conversation, he said, well, remember, like, be world-class at this job. And I remember kind of rolling my eyes as a typical teenager would do. I said, Dad, it's not that kind of job. It's not working for the Dean of Engineering. It's filing. I don't think I'll even see him. And he's like, but just think of it anyway. And so I got to the job, and there was this executive assistant, Sarah Scubis, was there, and she welcomed me. And the first job I had was to photocopy a stack of papers. And it was making photocopies for a meeting that was going to be held that day. And you had to photocopy them and then staple them together. And so I remember standing in front of this photocopy machine, and the words that my dad said, like, make this world class, inevitably floats into my head. And I'm thinking, how in the world do you make this kind of job world class? And so I decided, well, photocopy can sometimes be not particularly straight, and then becomes obvious it's a photocopy. You want it to be like really crisp. When you staple it, you want like the staple to be perfectly in line, or at least like exactly at that diagonal so someone can fold it over. And so I remember like sitting there, and this wasn't one of those fancy photocopy machines that auto collates everything. I would get everything put together, stack it, staple it, and I put a lot of care into that effort. And this job continued for basically all 4 years I was in college. And it was accumulation of these experiences that was so important for me. There's no job that was below me. Everything was, anything that someone asked me to do, I would say, of course. And then it was that mentality of, if you're world class at this, you would be exceptional at this one thing right now.
And I talk about this in the story, but that led to you being asked to give a tour to a guy named Lou. You didn't realize he was Lou Platt, the CEO of HP, and I'll let people read the rest of the story. But he became a crucial influence in your career. How did that single encounter have kind of a lifelong impact for you?
Yeah, I think it's an interesting thing that a short encounter, and by short it was basically a week out of my life.
It was short, but world
class.
Yeah.
So game changing, right? And I think a lot of people of influence might think that they can have influence, but it has to be over this long period of time. But I was always struck by how, first of all, like the CEO of a Fortune 100 company notices basically a nobody, right? I had nothing to offer. I was a junior in college. My dad is a research scientist at NASA. 30-year career there. My mom is a homemaker. It's not like I have, networks or influence in any sphere. And he notices this literal nobody and decides to give me this opportunity. But the pictures that I have on my wall in my office from that encounter, which shows Bill Gates sitting in exactly the same spot I was, taught me a few things. So one was, notice those people. And as you grow in your own personal career and you have new opportunities, make sure you notice the people who are around you who might benefit from that. And I think that to me is real mentorship, because it's seeing the potential in someone before they even see it too. And championing someone, not because they have lots of champions, but because they don't. And so that's one element of that encounter that's really sort of stayed with me. A second piece is just true leadership. Lou Platt drove around in a Ford Taurus. He didn't have a driver. He didn't have a black car, no personal jet. He just drove around, celebrating his employees. He didn't have a corner office. He had basically a cubicle in the middle of this gigantic executive suite. Just the most humble human being. And then the last piece that really has stayed with me is just like, for me, the personal impact was the fact that he saw something in me before I even noticed it. The fact that he would imply, like, you sat in the same place as Bill Gates. You can do this. It changed actually the course of how I thought about myself, and therefore what the capacity of my dreams might be.
Yeah, I mean, you think about this in contrast to today, like it's so easy to lift someone up versus trying to tear them down, which is what, fortunately, what social media has become for a lot of us, and just what that one gesture meant to your whole career.
Yeah, it's truly life-changing, and I don't even know if he knew what it was and what it meant.
Now I want to ask you the opposite. Since you've made such a career and a platform of doing world class, what's something you can remember where you kind of mailed it in, and what was you didn't give your best, and the outcome wasn't what you wanted it to be?
There's probably too many examples of that, but here's one sort of that really stays with me. So I'm naturally pretty good at winging it. And so, especially with public speaking, I can sort of get up on stage or teach a class without a ton of preparation if I really had to. And I remember as I was getting started in my teaching career, there was a mentor of mine who teaches at the School of Business, and he used to be a CEO of a company. And he told me, Anne, for every lecture, I prepare 4 or 5 hours. And I remember I've watched him give these lectures. This is Mark Leslie. He does this incredible class on sales. And I remember thinking to myself, that's why those classes are so great. But there have been times, and there's one lecture that I really remember that I was giving. I was just super busy. My kids were all over me, and I just said, it's all right. Like, I can pull some of these slides together, and I will have it ready. And I remember the very vividly walking into the class, knowing that I wasn't 100% prepared, and knowing that there were some slides I had barely looked at. I had just sort of pulled it together, that I hadn't really thought through tightly what the story would be, what questions I wanted to ask. And to be honest, there have been times where it's been perfectly fine.
Yeah, got away with it.
but if you know what it feels like when you have prepared, and that the class is gelling and the students are engaged, and they know that you prepared, all of the details, and then you're comparing it to this situation where someone's asked you a question, you realize one of your slides doesn't totally make sense, or you haven't thought about the thing that the student has asked you. And, you know, the students I'm teaching, they're so smart, they can smell it. And this class in particular just started to go downhill. And I'm like sweating, and I can feel sort of it's not even animosity of the students, but they just know, right? And I felt so terrible during the class, but then probably for the week afterwards, it was like every time I would think about that class, I would get a huge knot in my stomach, because I knew everyone else knew, and I knew I knew. And
did you say something to the class?
You know, I said something to some of the students, because some of the students actually came and they were asking these questions, and I said, you know, I have to admit, like, that class was like one of the worst classes that I've taught. And it's hard for me to say, like, I totally learned the lesson, never happened again. It's never happened to that degree. But it's such a stark difference. Like yesterday, I had this session where I had really prepared, and the feeling is by the end, like, I'm even more energetic. It was like a 2-hour session. And by the end, like, I came out, like, I'm on Zoom, right? Which is like the least energy filling medium. And yet I came out of my office in my house, and I saw my kids, and we're about to eat dinner. And I was like excited.
Yeah.
And I knew I had nailed it. And there's nothing that feels like that, especially when you haven't nailed it and you know everyone else knows.
So that leads to my last question. Like, you know, for having built a career, you know, doing everything at a high level, it's got to take a lot of mental effort and capacity. Like, how do you get yourself in the right mindset to always do that, even if you don't want to?
I think it's the key is actually not having to do it in every sphere of your life. So whereas my dad used to say this was like every single homework assignment, you kind of need to know where you can slack off.
Where you can be bad. Yeah, this is Fran Fry's thing. Great speech on being bad to be good. Yeah.
So I'll tell you where I'm not world class. I am not world class at picking up after myself, and I probably think about that sometimes. I'm not world class at cleaning up all my dishes. I try to instill that into my children, and I hope that they will be world class at it. But I also really like that points to something, which is it shouldn't always be on you to be world class at everything, because in everything it's a team sport. Right? Whether it's in my work, I have a team that is world class at a lot of the things that they do. And a great example of that is my CFO. She is phenomenal at being a CFO. And I remember when I first joined Mike to be a 2-person team, he handed off all this stuff to me. And he's like, this will really be good for you to understand. You are now kind of like the COO of our firm, and you will run audit, and you will interface with our back office, which basically meant I was the CFO. I was a horrible CFO. And like the minute that I could actually offload that to someone who was professional and trust that they would be world class at it, that was great, right? And so to me, it's like, even within our small household, like, I count on my husband to be world class at doing his own laundry, you know, and I count on my kids to be world class at the chores that they do, because if you feel like you have to do it in every single element of your life, that's impossible. And then you have to figure out, where does it count, right?
Yeah.
That next lecture that I'm doing, it matters. You know, this conversation for me, that really matters. When I'm engaged in a conversation with the CEO of a company, it matters. But, you know, there's a lot of other things where it doesn't matter. I'm horrible at gardening. Our tomato plants have died. And in fact, mint, which is apparently a weed, has been killed multiple times in our garden, right? And so where are the places that I want to put my mental energy and high expectations versus where am I totally fine being completely sub-world class? You want to be intentional about it, but at the
Absolutely.
same time, you got to cut yourself some slack.
All right, well, Anne, your world-class standard gives us all something to strive for. So if you haven't read Anne's story, it's called World Class. It's in the Friday Forward book. Check it out, and thank you very much for joining the launch event.
Thank you.